I have a lot of records. Like a lot. A lot. About 300 albums, about just as many singles. And of course, in all of that, there's a lot of interesting stuff. And I love to talk about it. Unfortunately, no one ever asks. So here I am giving it to you. So let's begin where all good things should, at the beginning. And the beginning in the case of my collection is this. That is an Edison Cylinder, introduced, as it says right on the rim, July 29th, 1902. In my case, it is labeled as a sketch, A Talk on Married Life by Hill. It's old. Very old. Made sometime between 1902 and 1910. As such, I have no way of playing this. Cylinder players are not easy to come by now, as they were expensive back then. But this was a godsend. If you didn't have the money to go out to your concert at your local public park, probably sit in a gazebo or something, I don't know, it was the 1900s, you'd buy one of these things. For just $1, you could hear 3 minutes of whatever they put on it. Music, operas, speeches, in this case stand-up comedy. However, naturally, being made of wax, they would wear out after a little while. So, in 1910, they introduced these. The Edison Blue Amberol record. What is Amberol, you may ask? No one really knows. Well, Edison might have, but it looks pretty similar, except the wax now has a bluish tint. But they last much, much longer. These can hold up to about 100 plays. They still hold about 3 minutes of audio. In this case, this one is labeled My Father Watches Over Me, so I believe it's something religious. It's also labeled Roadhaver and Chorus. It's got a nice Edison logo there. This case patented 45? I'm not sure what that means. These definitely weren't being sold in 1945. Because quite soon after these hit the market, maybe by the end of the 1910s, Edison had a little idea that he kind of stole from a guy named Pathé. What if we flatten it? This is the Edison Disc, also known as the Diamond Disc. These ones are labeled as recreations because they're stuff you could have already bought on these cylinders, but put on a disc now. They still hold about 3 minutes on each side, but now you got 2 sides. These are a little bit different, a little bit less than standard from what you might assume. They spun at about 80 RPM, which is very, very fast. As such, they could only hold 3 minutes, as I've already said. They are very thick and very heavy. They have wood pulp on the inside, and they've been coated in shellac. So very thick, very easily breakable. Not a lot of these still out there. We'll come back to that, because this will be important later. Hey, I just wanted to break in here while I was editing to point out that I never actually explained why Edison discs are different. So let me do that. They're called diamond discs because they use diamond styli rather than the standard steel ones at the time. Also, they're not compatible with modern record players because their grooves go up and down rather than side to side as you see in most modern records. So of course these were a big success in the market. So people wanted to capitalize on that. So those records cost about $1, but something like this, the standard disc record, made by the Standard Talking Machine Company in Chicago, would have been a little bit cheaper, as noted by this sticker on the back, which says that this record is 60 cents. So less than $1. But you do get some trade-offs. You only get one song. It's going to be exactly as long. It's not going to have any well-known artists because they're all here. And if you noticed, the spindle hole is a different size. It's much bigger over here. That's because the ironically named standard disc record was not very standard at all. It rotated a lot faster. It had a larger spindle hole, meaning you could only play it on machines made by the Standard Talking Machine Company. And that's where they got you. The discs themselves were cheaper, but the players were very, very expensive. And once you bought one, you were stuck with these. So, of course, somebody has to come along and standardize it. That's where we get into stuff like this. This is your standard 78 RPM 10-inch disc. Still made of shellac, but rotates much slower, 78. This became the industry standard for a very long time. These were introduced in the 20s. These were phased out in the 50s. This song is important. I will come back to it in a later video. If you recognize it, good for you. The 10-inch record, still leaving something to be desired, with its still about 3-minute runtime, was then supplanted by these. This is the 12-inch 78 RPM record. Same material, still a large disc of shellac, but these held 5 minutes per side. This one, in this case, plays the Blue Danube. So a little bit of classical music there. If you recognize that label, Parlophone was very well known, and still is very well known. They're one of the biggest record labels in the UK. They've held people like the Beatles, David Bowie, and even Gorillaz. Of course, if you know anything about records, you'll know that that's not where the story stops. There were 2 new formats introduced in 1947, both competing with each other, and both competing to replace the 78 RPM record. The first was RCA's 45. These, as the name entails, spun at 45 RPM and could fit about 5 minutes on each side. When they first came out, they were color-coded. This one is yellow, which places it in the children's label. Most of the ones you're going to see are black. Color coding was very expensive to do, so they just made everything black the following year. At the same time, the LP was introduced. This is the now standard format. Has been since 1947. You can fit much more on each side. You can fit up to 40 minutes on each side if you really stretch it in there, really squeeze it. And of course, you can fit multiple songs on it per side, something that really wasn't a thing for most 78s or 45s. There were, of course, exceptions to this rule. This is called an EP, an extended play. As you can see, maybe you can see there in the camera, it has 2 tracks on each side. This specific one is from a label called Tops. These came out on these nice clear red vinyls. These were sold at a much lower price than a normal single, and you wouldn't find any big name singers on here. These were mainly just instrumental covers of well-known songs. Now that I've got a brief chronology out of the way, let's talk about some of the weirder stuff I got. This is what's known as a hit of the week. These were made by the Durium Company. They're printed on durium, which is a fancy name for a piece of cardboard with some plastic on top. So what these were sold at a very, very low price, I think 50 cents. And you get a song on each side. They'd be much cheaper than buying a normal record. The problem is, being made of cardboard, they don't really sit flat. Kind of have to push them down. They'll still play well, because they're pretty much just a vinyl record playing at 78 RPM. But, just kind of cheap. Those only lasted for about 1 year, 1937 to 38. The same idea would be revisited in the 60s, much more successfully, might I add, with things like these. These are Flexi Discs. They usually be included in magazines or books. This one is a Life Audio soundtrack talking about Humphrey Bogart. This one is Organs and Chimes with a Christmas message on the other end. I assume this would have been sent in a magazine or a newspaper or something. But as the name implies, Flexi Discs, they are very, very flexible. So put yourself in the mind of somebody in 1947. You've just upgraded to a nice new hi-fi. You can play those fancy LPs everybody's talking about. What do you do with your old 78 only player? Easy. Give it to your kids. These are from a company called Peter Pan Records, and what they did is they made these unbreakable, as they call them, very thick plastic records that spun at 78 RPM with kids' songs on it. We got Big Rock Candy Mountain, Old MacDonald Had a Farm. Here's not really an album, just a bunch of short songs on a slightly bigger disc. But these ran at 78 RPM. So Once you had gotten rid of your old player and got a new hi-fi, you could give these ones to your kids, and then they'd have a toy record player all of their own. So that's a fun little thing. Records for kids would continue on for a while, especially with stuff like book and records. Here's one I have. This one, it says it's Bugs Bunny, but it's really just Mel Blanc having a Bugs Bunny aneurysm.
What's up, Doc? Hey, you had a party that advertised in the paper for a gentle, kindly, loyal, lovable new pet. That's correct. I did. Well, I'm your rabbit. A rabbit. What a good idea.
So you got a record in the back, and of course there's text on the page, and whenever you hear the ding on the record, turn the page. That's pretty much how that went. I have a few other book and records. I don't have the books for them, so they end up being kind of boring. We have an adaptation of The Last Starfighter, which I haven't seen, but I've heard is also kind of boring. And The Last Gremlin, Story 5.
The water fountain in the greenhouse. Stripe's going to jump into the water. Turn it off or it'll multiply, and soon there'll be hundreds more gremlins.
Kate frantically searched for a shut-off switch.
Which one could it be, Gizmo?
There was no response.
I don't know. I wasn't alive for the Gremlins craze. Got two more kids things here. This one I think is pretty interesting. An introduction to manned Mercury spaceflight. On this side, a guy sort of explains the Mercury program and what it is, and on the other side, this is more interesting, actual Mercury spaceflight communications.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Roger, the clock is operating. We're underway. You're loud and clear. Roger, we're programming and roll okay. A little bumpy along about here. Roger. Stand by for 20 seconds. Roger. 2, 1, mark.
I also have this. This is another partial toy. I don't have the rest of it. This is the Hammond Talking Map. Sounds a lot cooler than it is. Basically, you play this record and it tells you look at the number, and then you look at the number that's on the map that went with this. And that's it. And then it would explain about what it's pointing out. Two sides. It's like 5 minutes. Nothing really interesting happening there. Just a little in between here. I have a sleeve from Vandergrift's Music Shop, 35 Baltimore Street, Western Maryland's oldest music headquarters. This was the record shop in Cumberland. It's not there anymore, but, you know, Baltimore Street's still there. I'm sure there's lots of people around who still remember that store. So now we're getting into some really interesting stuff. When you recorded a disc, especially a 78, you would need to record it to something to be sent off to the factory to make the stampers. That's called an acetate. So this is an acetate disc. It's not made of shellac. It's actually vinyl on top of aluminum. You can see a little bit of it showing through there. So what would happen here is you would cut your record onto this, and this would get sent off to the factory, and this is what would become the final disc. Now, if you're wondering about the multiple spindle holes, it's to ensure that it doesn't slip at all once you're writing the record, because it takes a lot more force to write a record than it does to actually read it back. I have another interesting one like that from the Presto Record Company, and it's labeled WTBO Cumberland, Maryland. And that station is indeed still there. There's a little acetate. It's an inside start disc. Just a little message. And it's labeled 1960. Nothing on the back, but you can see that extra spindle hole to prevent slippage. Of course, if you didn't want to go to a radio station or a record company, there were record booths that you could go to print your own records. So here's one. This is a Howard recording disc, labeled as slow burning, and it's dated January 7th, 1943. Not sure what's on this. I don't even know if it could play back correctly if I tried. but that's from one of those record booths. Here's another one. This is one from the Southwest Furniture and Radio Store, 8620 South Broadway. Washers, ranges, refrigerators, appliances. It's got a date there. I really can't read it. Sometime in the 30s, maybe. But just like with this one here, this would be a booth that you would go into and you'd put in some money and you could record your message to a disc and then mail these discs home to your friends if you were, say, sightseeing somewhere. I assume Broadway is probably New York City. That's all the interesting stuff that I have down here in the basement, apart from this little disc labeled A Day to Remember, June 8th, 1969. I have no idea what's on this or what I'm supposed to remember on that day. I'm going to keep that a mystery for right now. In the next video I do, we're going to look at my actual collection. I've got some kind of rare, kind of expensive stuff up there that I'm sure is probably more interesting than anything in this pile. If you have any questions, please ask. I might do a video more in depth of any of these if anybody thinks they're interesting. So that's it for now.